Okay. So, Professor Anil Seth, welcome to the Flame of Reason podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
You are a professor of cognitive and computational neuroscience. That's what it's called, right?
Yeah, it's an unfortunately long title, which I kind of regret now. but yes, it's pretty accurate. It's what I do. Study the brain from these perspectives.
Yeah, explain to us the computational aspect in here. What does it mean?
It means different things to different people. What it means for me is not that I think the brain is a computer. Actually, I don't think that's true. I think the computer is a useful but limited metaphor for what brains are and what they do. What it means to me is that, I use a lot of computational methods to try to understand the brain. I mean, this can just be simulating different aspects of the brain, different analysis methods. I think that for me is what computational neuroscience means.
Okay, I see. We're definitely coming back to that, but I just want to say that the reason we talk right now is because your book, Being You, is just out in Sweden. It's called the same thing, actually, in Swedish, Att vara du, a new science of consciousness. It's the exact translation, actually. And before we talk about your book and what you write about in your book, I actually like to start with the question: what is it like to be you, Anil Seth? And what I mean is, how did you develop your interest in these topics? Where does it come from?
I've been asked this a lot, and it always surprises me a little bit. I always feel a little bit uncertain how to answer, because it seems to me a very obvious thing to be interested in. I get the feeling that most people at some point in their lives, probably quite early on, I certainly remember as a child, just these questions appearing. Who am I? Why am I me? Why am I not somebody else? What happens when I die? Where was I before I was born? In a sense, these are quite childish questions. We all wonder these things. And I think I always kept coming back to them. They just provided this sort of North Star. And the questions have changed a little bit over the course of my life. And I haven't always been researching and studying consciousness and the self, but I've kept coming back to it.
Did you grow up in a family of scientists or?
Not really. So my father was an engineer, so I guess so. But by the time I came along, he was more doing sort of management of quality control for ESSO, which is now Exxon in the US. My mother was an English teacher and later a photographer. So I grew up in an environment where I was really encouraged to follow my interests. And I actually think having one parent more on the art side and one more on the science side was a big influence on me, because the study of consciousness is exactly, I think, in this intersection. Yes, I mean, I'm mainly a scientist. My day job is as a scientist. But to make progress in understanding something like consciousness really does require philosophy and other contributions from the humanities too.
That's a very interesting perspective. And you said when we started to talk here that you don't really think that the brain is a computer. In what sense is it not a computer, would you say?
Well, of course, now I'm going to give the annoying philosophical answer first, which is it depends what you mean by a computer, right? Even this word means different things to different people. I mean, some people say that computation is actually fundamental to the universe. The universe is one big computer, or the most fundamental level of reality, everything computes. And I don't really buy into this. I mean, it might be true, but I don't buy into it. So really here I'm talking about the kinds of computers we're familiar with. The laptop that I'm speaking to you on, that I wrote the book on, the phones we carry around in our pockets, the servers that run the internet. These are kind of classic digital computers, and they're a very specific type of thing. Not everything is a computer. My laptop is a computer. My kettle in the kitchen is not a computer. It doesn't compute. And computing really, in this context, what it means is you have a system which basically follows a recipe. It takes some sort of input, it processes it in some way, manipulates it, and spits out an output. And it does it in a way, and this is critical, it does it in a way that in principle doesn't depend on what it's made of. I mean, that's what the beauty of computation, right? You know, you can take the same computer and run many different programs on it. That's what makes it useful. And you can build a computer out of many different things. I mean, we use silicon at the moment because it's very.
It goes back. It goes back to the universal Turing machine. I guess that's the sort of abstract definition of a computer.
Yes, it is. It's where it's the principle on which modern computers work. They're universal Turing machines. They can implement any function which is so-called Turing computable. But the point is that that's a limited number of things. And it's not. To me, it's still a bit of an open question. Like, it's clear that brains are like computers in many important ways. I mean, we take input from the world. It's transduced into neural activity, electrical activity into our brains. Stuff happens. And then we say things and we do things. So I think it's reasonable to talk about that, at least in part as computation of a sort. But it's not clear to me that that's all brains do. You know, brains are really complex physical systems. There are lots of chemicals washing around as well. Electrical fields are generated, and I think neuroscience is getting to the point where we're beginning to realize the limitations of this view of the brain as a computer. And we're beginning to use new kinds of tools from mathematics, you know, the kinds of things that are used to describe, I don't know, how birds flock together or how weather systems evolve. And of course, we can use computers to simulate all of these systems. And we do that. I do that. But it doesn't mean that the system itself is a computer. I mean, nobody thinks that a hurricane is actually computing its own windiness. You know, it just does what it does. And so that's the question for the brain. And some things we do are well described as computations. When I play chess, you know, that's really, I mean, I don't play chess, but assume I did play chess. That's very, very well described as a kind of computation. But if I'm maybe running to catch a ball or just standing up and picking up an object, is that completely described as a computation? That's much less clear, I think. And the closer you look at the brain, I think the more evident it is that brains are the kinds of things where what they do, you know, how they transforms inputs into outputs, is very, very difficult to separate what they do from what they are, from what they're made of. Like in a computer, there's always, by design, there's this kind of bright line, this clear separation between the software and the hardware. But in a brain, you know, I like to think in terms of mindware and wetware. There are things we do and there is the stuff we're made of. And there's no sharp division in the brain between what we might call the mindware and the wetware. And there's no reason for there to be so, because our brains evolved. They weren't designed. And evolution didn't really care about this kind of clean separability, because what's happening in my brain doesn't need to run on anybody else's brain, you know, in the same way that my version of Microsoft Word does need to run on a different computer.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Sometimes it pops up this argument saying that Gödel, with his incompleteness theorem, showed that there are limits to what you can prove in a mathematical system, and therefore the brain cannot be a computer. I mean, some kind of reference to Gödel's incompleteness theorem. What do you think of that kind of argument? Is it valid in any way?
I think it's valid, but I'm not sure how sound it is when it's applied to the brain. I mean, again, philosophers like to make this distinction between sort of arguments that follow through logically and like are valid, and arguments that are sound and that they apply in the situation.
Okay, good distinction. Yeah,
and yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to. I don't know enough sort of logic to. I'm happy to accept that Gödel is right. It seems very well accepted. And what he's really saying is that, you know, in any formal system, so, you know, formal system which is defined by a set of logical rules, there are statements which are true but which cannot be shown to be true within
the system.
Yeah. So that's fine. I don't know quite what the relevance of that is to the brain. And there might be. I mean, Roger Penrose was one of the first people to kind of make this case, and he's sort of saying that, well, we can sort of see things that are true that cannot be shown to be true within a given system of propositions. But, you know, I think you could probably get around that by just sort of changing the set of logical propositions that we're working with. It's one sort of line of attack against the idea that brains are computers. I actually think there are many others which are more powerful, including this idea that you can't separate in a brain what it does from what it is. And, you know, Gödel does make, and Turing made this point too, that there are many functions which are not computable by a Turing machine. This was one of Turing's great discoveries.
And that's the famous paper called Uncomputable Numbers, I think.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so, and then there's just other observations, like any system which is random in some way is not fully computable by a Turing machine, because, you know, you need to know what the, you know, just randomness is not a computable function. And even if it's deterministic, even if there's no randomness at all, I mean, we know from physics and the physics of chaos theory and so on, that there's such a sensitivity to initial conditions that, given that the brain is like largely this continuous system, you have spikes, but a lot of things just vary continuously, like, you know, strengths of synapses and levels of chemicals and so on, that it's not clear that a Turing computable function would be able to capture with sufficient precision this sensitivity to initial conditions without sort of diverging in just extreme ways quite quickly. But I think the broad point is it's very, and it's very interesting actually. The assumption that the brain is a kind of computer and that computation is sort of sufficient for cognition and even consciousness is really very widespread until quite recently. And I've just noticed there's a little bit of pushback now in the last couple of years. With people beginning to just say, or at least just recognize that it's an assumption, you know, that is being made. And I think a lot of this, maybe we're going to talk about this later, a lot of this has been because of the recent explosion of interest in artificial intelligence. And it's become so much more on the radar. And there's a sort of, and that really, you know, and if you think the AI systems that we have could be conscious or could be really intelligent, you know, then you're often relying on this assumption that computation is sufficient. And it's not that there's a single knockdown argument against it, but there's an increasing recognition that, hold on, you know, this is a really quite a big assumption. It may be true, you know, it may not be true.
I mean, let's talk about that when you mention it. I mean, I completely agree that it's an assumption you have to take as an axiomatic assumption, but you don't share that. I mean, you don't think that AI could be conscious. Is that what you're saying?
I'm very skeptical. I think we have to live with a certain amount of uncertainty here, and this is because you know, it's strange to admit, having just written a book about consciousness, but I don't think we have sufficient understanding of how consciousness happens, you know, even in those cases where we're sure it's there, like in you and me, and maybe many other non-human animals. So we just can't be 100% sure about other systems, whether they're AI systems or collections of cells in a dish, organoids, or insects or fish, or, you know, we don't know for sure. But there has been this kind of widespread assumption that artificial intelligence that's conscious, let's call it real artificial consciousness, is a matter of when, not if. That it's on the way, and it's sort of just going to come along for the ride as AI systems get smarter. You know, you always see these exponential graphs and things just getting quicker and quicker and quicker. And then at some point, you know, we reach general artificial intelligence and some singularity or something like that. And there's this just general cultural assumption that somewhere along that line, the lights come on and these systems are not only smart, but also conscious.
Self-aware, yeah. But isn't that, I mean, isn't the argument for that just the fact that it happened in the evolution at least once?
Sure, but I think that is just an argument that consciousness, I mean, that's very compatible with many perspectives on consciousness. Like the view I have, which I try to defend and explain and in the book and in other things, is thinking about consciousness as more tied to our nature as living systems than as kind of meat-based computers that wander around the world. And of course, the observation that consciousness arose in evolution is probably more in line with the view that consciousness is a property of life than being a property of computers, because computers didn't evolve. We designed them to do specific things. So I'm very interested in this space. First, in just understanding, firstly, like what are our psychological biases that drive us to think that AI might be or become conscious? And we have so many psychological biases. And at least knowing those can help us clarify the assumptions we're making. And then, like, what are the more fundamental assumptions? Like this assumption that computation is sufficient for consciousness. Now, that's a big assumption. How strong is it? And I think there are good reasons to question that. And then, the third part of the puzzle is trying to say, okay, if consciousness is not a matter of computation and is not just going to come along for free as AI gets smarter, what are the good arguments that it is really a property of life rather than computation? I think if you consider all these three things together, it's not that we get 100% sure, but I think to me, it's not something I set out like years ago intending to show. It's just where I found the arguments lead, that it's a very plausible position that consciousness is more like life than it is like information processing.
Interesting. But I think there's another thing trending right now, and that is the idea of panpsychism, I think it's called in English. I mean, the idea that consciousness is a property of matter in a way. What's your take on that? Is that a good theory?
I'm not particularly appealed to it, and I have quite frequent and very enjoyable and informative arguments with panpsychists. Like there's a prominent panpsychist called Philip Goff who
I know
who's,
him.
who's written about this, and we talk about. I was with him at a meeting earlier this month, and we again revisited the same kinds of things. So I don't find it appealing. It's like all of these isms: materialism, physicalism, dualism, idealism. You can't really prove or disprove any of them. They're metaphysical positions. Some of them are more sensible than others. Dualism is a particularly hard to defend one, even though it seems intuitively appealing. The idea that consciousness is a really separate domain of existence from the physical world. I mean, Descartes was the first person to really formalize this or certainly make it the accepted view. This is really hard to make sense of. Dualism. You have these two separate worlds. How do they interact and so on? Philip Goff will always make the point, and it's a valid point, that all of the sort of science that we know, the scientific theories and empirical observations about the brain, entirely compatible with panpsychism, or indeed with idealism. And I agree with that. That's fine. But what I struggle with is that panpsychism just doesn't seem to be a very useful idea. It almost so it is the idea that consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous. It's not, it's not the idea that my table is conscious, or my pair of glasses has a sense of self. It's just that, like mass and energy, consciousness is built into the universe at the most basic level. The problem I have with that is it kind of solves the problem of consciousness by definition, and it introduces other problems. Like, how do you get from small conscious things to big conscious things? Like, if I want to understand the difference between me now and me under anesthesia.
Yeah, it doesn't really explain anything. That's my main argument against it. So I think that's a little bit what you're saying. It doesn't really explain anything.
It doesn't really explain anything. It introduces, I mean, panpsychists would say, well, it explains consciousness because it's there at the beginning. And it's like, well, okay, but that's not a very, you have to then ask, what should explanations do? They should provide insight into the nature of a phenomenon, and they should help you, make predictions and so on. It doesn't really do that. And as a sort of historical point, I also, Philip is right that scientific observations are compatible with panpsychism. But my response is always that, I think that having a basically materialist view, which is the view that consciousness is a property of matter, organized somehow. We don't yet know exactly how. That's a very pragmatically useful thing to do. I don't think we would have done the science that we've done if we were all panpsychists. We would have been doing other things. So yes, it's compatible, but I don't think it's generative. And there's this a great influence on me is the philosopher of science Imre Lakatos, and he has this idea that scientific programs can be productive or degenerate. Not that they're necessarily right or wrong, but do they lead people to do things which sort of build in a productive way on what's been done before? And for me, having a sort of pragmatic materialist view, I don't know if it's right or not, but it leads me and many other of my colleagues to do the kinds of experiments and develop the kinds of theories that I think have explanatory power, even if they're in the end still compatible with panpsychism.
I see what you mean. Yeah, very interesting. Talking about your book a little bit, you discussed the brain in your book as a prediction machine. Can you explain what you mean by that?
I can try. It's not a new idea, but I'm trying to sort of take it in a different direction. So I think the best way to understand it is to think about the problem a brain faces. Brains, they're locked away inside this bony vault of a skull. They're trying to control the body, and they're trying to figure out what's going on out there in the world, and really do both things at once, so that the organism maximizes its chance of staying alive. Now, the brain doesn't have any direct access to what's out there in the world or in here in the body. All it has access to are these electrical signals, which are only indirectly related to what's going on. So the brain is, in this sense, it's facing a problem of abduction, of inference to the best explanation, of best guessing, of Bayesian inference. All of these things I'm using equivalently here. Is having to infer what's going on the basis of ambiguous data. And how does it do that? Well, analytically, this is a really, really tricky problem to solve for anything. But there is a way that physical systems like brains can approximate Bayesian inference, can reach a best guess about the causes of its sensory signals. And that is what this theory of predictive processing offers. And in this theory, the idea is that the brain is continually making predictions about what's out there in the world, or in the sort of hierarchy of the brain, what's happening one level down in the brain's hierarchy. and then using the sensory signals to update these predictions, to calibrate them. And it turns out that if the brain follows a simple rule of trying to update its predictions to minimize these sensory prediction error signals, so the sensory signals are now treated as prediction errors, differences between what the brain predicts and what it gets. Simple rule, try and just minimize these prediction errors. This leads to an approximation to this problem of inference. The brain is going to settle on a optimal or approximately optimal best guess of what's going on. That's one part of the story. The second part of the story is that this mechanism of prediction as a way of inferring what's going on is actually also a fantastic way to implement control. Like once you can predict something, you can control it very well. Here, you still minimize prediction errors, but you have some sort of prior state, but that's now a goal state rather than just a sort of arbitrary starting point. So, my brain might have a prior expectation that my body temperature is around 37 degrees Celsius. And then it can, make various changes so that that prediction becomes, if you like, self-fulfilling. And my body ends up being regulated around this body temperature, homeostatically regulated. So from this sort of evolutionary perspective, it makes a lot of sense that brains evolve to keep the body alive, and that involves regulating the body according to these kind of set points. But it also involves figuring out what's going on in the body and in the world. And this core process of forming and updating predictions is just a great way to do both things. And it sounds like a very computational thing. And of course, we can implement this computationally too. People in machine learning do this. It doesn't mean that the way the brain is doing it is the same way a computer would do it. There are other ways brains can do this in a more dynamic, continuous way. But that's the basic idea. And then the claim for consciousness is what we experience is not a readout of the sensory signals. It's the content. It's the best guess itself. It's the prediction. So our experiences are coming more from the top down or the inside out than from the outside in.
That's really interesting. So what you're saying is that we actually create our view of reality from within, but we make it compatible with a sensory input.
That's why I use the kind of slogan of perception as a controlled hallucination. And no slogan is perfect, but it's getting that idea. Yeah, it comes from within, but critically, it's not arbitrary. It's very, very tightly coupled to reality, whether that's the reality of the world or the reality of the body. But it's indirect. Back in philosophy, Immanuel Kant talked about indirect realism, and Helmholtz in the 19th century was the first person to talk about perception in this kind of way. And I think it's a very attractive way to link up, a number of different levels. We can connect the phenomenological level, what our experiences are like. We can connect that with function. What role do they serve for the organism? And then we can connect it down to mechanism. Like, what are the neural circuits and physiological processes that underlie all this? And for me, that's really when you start to have something with appealing explanatory power.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Can you actually do experiments now that shows that this theory seems to be right, so to speak? Do you do that kind of experiments?
I mean, we try, and I think this is, in all frankness, this is kind of the weak point of this theory, is how empirically testable it is, experimentally testable. And one reason is that you can kind of fit many different kinds of data to the same basic idea. But having said that, there are experiments that I think really do flesh out the idea, not necessarily test it directly. But for instance, we've done studies in my lab over years now, which show that what the brain is expecting in this kind of top-down way really changes what we consciously experience. And so that we, in vision, for instance, we visually experience what our brain is expecting more accurately and more quickly than what the brain is not expecting, which is very much in line with what you would hypothesize from this theory, that there's a closer match of expectation and bottom-up sensory signal. Now, other people are looking in more detail at the brain dynamics underlying all this and trying to really figure out if there's this top-down stream of information that conveys what we are conscious of more so than the bottom-up flow of information. And we're doing a little bit of that, but there are other labs doing a much better job and showing indeed that you can read out in brain imaging data what a person is experiencing from signals that are flowing in this top-down direction. And that's good evidence. But it's very hard to sort of test and this is something I struggle with. Now, the place I get to in the book is really, okay, this whole notion of the brain as a prediction machine bottoms out for me in the idea that consciousness is intimately connected with life. Now, this is very hard to experimentally test that. I don't yet know of a way we can do that. So it's more in the domain of like, given this set of ideas, what kinds of useful experiments can we do that sort of shed light on the brain basis of consciousness rather than trying to test the theory head on?
I see. Still, I recently read about a quite funny experiment. I think it was made by a Swedish scientist, but I'm not sure of that, showing that our perception is not always accurate. And the experiment was like this. You put up on a big computer screen like 200 small pictures of people randomly over the screen, and one of them is you. And then you measure how fast you find yourself among these 200 people, okay? And then you regenerate them and put them on different places many times, and you get an average. But then if the picture of you is photoshopped, so you look better than you do in real life, then you find yourself faster. Have you heard about this?
I haven't. I like it though.
It's quite fun, yeah. Quite funny. Yeah. So it seems like we don't really have the right picture of the world always.
Yeah. No, I mean I'm gonna look that up. I quite like it, and
yeah,
it just makes me wonder. I wonder if the speed advantage would be different for different people. Maybe the more narcissistic someone is, the more even more quickly they'd find the better looking version of themselves. Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to test it, and it would be interesting. Like if you had someone like me, and you put a photo of me with hair again, would I find myself more quickly or more slowly? I don't know. That could be a good test of narcissism.
That's very funny. Yeah.
Anyway, we digress. The basic point is exactly right, and it really follows almost just by thinking about how perception must work. And this goes back to Kant and so on, and Helmholtz, and that perception, almost by definition, cannot be accurate in the sense of replicating physical reality in this sort of mental picture we have in our head. It doesn't really even make sense to say that. We never see reality as it really is. And there's a beautiful quote from Anil Seth: "We don't see things as they are; we see them as we are." And this is very evident in something like color. When we look around, we experience color as this sort of mind-independent property of reality. Like the books on your shelf behind you look just to have the colors that they have. But of course, we know that color is a collaboration between the world and the brain. Light waves get reflected, but our eyes contain cells that are sensitive to 3 wavelengths, and out of the balance of those 3 wavelengths, the brain constructs this experience of color, which is useful because it helps us keep track of objects when lighting conditions change. But color isn't accurate in the sense that it's out there. But our perception of color isn't wrong either. It's just useful. It's accurately tracking some invariant feature of the world. So this is different from, you know, if I have an uncontrolled hallucination, I wake up and I see a bear at the foot of the bed or something, right? Okay, that's less accurate than when I see a red car across the road. You know, there's a greater departure from how reality really is. But all of our perceptual experiences is constructed, but it's geared to the world. And one implication of this, which is kind of fascinating for me and is an empirical question, is we all have different brains, so we all likely have slightly different experiences, even for the same shared objective reality. And I think this is, you know, people have studied individual differences for quite a while, how we differ in specific mental traits and perceptual traits. But I think we probably underestimate how different our inner worlds really are. And it's not that somebody's is more accurate than somebody else's. Of course, if you are actually hallucinating a bear, then your perception is less accurate than people who aren't.
Yeah.
But if you see a color slightly different to me, you know, is that less or more accurate? It doesn't make sense to say that. It's not a question
of course. And I guess we can never know if we perceive the color blue the same way or not. But it doesn't really matter because we have been taught to call it blue, right?
Well, I think you're right and wrong here. I think we can figure out a lot. In fact, one of the projects that I've been working on since the book and I'm very excited about is this project called the Perception Census. That's in collaboration with a philosopher colleague of mine in Glasgow, Fiona McPherson, and Collective Act, this organization in London. And what we've done here is it's a fairly ambitious online experiment where we enrolled nearly around 40,000 people, and they all did several hours of online experiments, a lot of effort to try and empirically get a grip on things like individual differences in color, because you can measure it. You know, for instance, you can show a patch of color and then other patches of color and ask people to rate how similar the first one is to the subsequent ones.
Okay.
And so you can, even though I think this is often a big misunderstanding about the scientific study of consciousness. You know, people will often say, well, how you can't measure consciousness. You can't get, you know, I can never put a conscious experience on the table and look at it. Sure, but, you know, psychologists have been getting data about conscious experiences since the beginning of psychology through methods like this, which, you know, we broadly call psychophysics. So, yeah, we can do lots of experiments that shed some light on how we do differ in our experiences. And I think it matters too, because I think you're right, we use words to cover up these differences sometimes. If we both refer to the car as red, then fine. But I think there's a lot to be gained from cultivating a bit more humility about our own take on things. You know, recognizing that the way we see things is not the way everybody else sees things, or the way things, you know, really are. You know, in this sense, is a bit of a guerrilla approach to try and diffuse some of the dynamics in social media echo chambers and things like that. You know, if you and I can really see this thing differently, then maybe it's no surprise that we can think different things as well, without assuming that our way is the only way.
I see what you mean. Okay, that's quite interesting, really. Another thing, I know that in popular culture there is always all these ideas about the left brain, the left part of the brain and the right part of the brain, and the differences between them and so on. And there seems to be also quite sophisticated ideas about this like Ian McGilchrist, for example, who seems to be trending on YouTube. What do you think of these ideas and his ideas with the master and his emissary? I'm sure you're familiar.
Yeah, in fact, at the same meeting that I was talking to Philip Goff at in Scotland, Ian McGilchrist was there too. It was actually the first time we'd met in person, and it's very enjoyable to talk to him about his. Yeah, he's been very influential with, especially that book, The Master and His Emissary.
Yeah,
I'm not entirely sure what I think about this issue. I tend to think it's a bit overblown. right? There are some brain functions which are usually fairly clearly lateralized to one hemisphere or the other. Language is the main example of that. You know, in the human brain, language is usually on the left and not on the right, though there are exceptions. And in general, it does seem defensible that the left hemisphere is somewhat more concerned with sort of detail, and the right hemisphere is somewhat more concerned with generalities in a holistic take.
There is support for that in experiments.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. It's out of my wheelhouse, so I don't know how strong the support is, but I think there is. It's less clear to me that, you know, you can construct a kind of grand narrative of the history of human civilization on that basis. But I think it's, you know, it's an interesting line to take to see how far you can get that way. That's what Ian has embarked on. But overemphasizing these differences, I think, overlooks the fact that in most cases, both hemispheres of the brain are working together. Now, you have these classic split brain cases where people with intractable epilepsy have the connectivity between the two hemispheres severed, cut. Usually, often not totally, but sometimes totally.
And Michael Gazzaniga has studied that.
Mike Gazzaniga and Roger Sperry pioneered this kind of the study of these patients and these surgeries. And you get some very intriguing effects with split brain patients that, you know, under certain circumstances, it can seem as if each hemisphere has a mind of its own. What's frankly more remarkable about split brain patients is that most of the time you really don't notice that their brains have been cut in half.
That's really fascinating.
that for me is the more remarkable observation. But I think there's an ongoing, you know, debate, at least in philosophy, about how we interpret these things. Maybe in some cases there are two separate minds in a split brain patient, but in normal circumstances there's just one, and you kind of have this sort of switching between these two modes. The philosopher Peter Godfrey Smith talks a lot about this. And, you know, humans are actually, turns out, quite unusual in having this massive connectivity between the two hemispheres. You know, many other animals don't, which is also, you know, kind of surprising. Which might suggest that actually what's distinctive about humans is the degree to which our hemispheres work together, not the degree to which they do different things.
Wow. Okay, I didn't know that. That's really interesting. But as I understood it, these split brain patients, if you cover one eye, you can have situations where they can tell what they see, but they can't write it. And then if you cover the other eye, they can write it but not tell it. Do you recognize that?
Yeah, it's not writing and telling. They're both language things. So they're both on the left. So a typical, like the classic example would be, you show an image to it's also visual fields, and it's not eyes. It's a kind of technicality, but it's important because actually each eye sends information to both hemispheres of the brain. But the left side of each visual field goes to the right hemisphere and vice versa. So you kind of have to present information to the left or the right side, not the left or the right eye. But in any case, so if you show an image to the right visual field, so it comes to the left hemisphere, and now you're seeing me on camera, so I'm not sure if this mirror image is even is the right way around. It's getting very confusing. But the image comes to my left hemisphere. Now I will be able to tell you what I see. You know, maybe I see, I don't know, a riverbank or something like that. I'll also be able to write it down. If I show the image instead to the left visual field, which goes to the right hemisphere, and then I ask the person verbally, you know, what do you see? They won't say they see anything, right? So their left hemisphere apparently doesn't have access to what's going on in the right hemisphere in this case visually. But if you ask the person to draw what's going on, they kind of can.
Okay.
But then you ask the person, why did they draw that? And they'll often make something up, which has got nothing to do with the image. They'll confabulate something. So this is the kind of classic example. One issue is a lot of these experiments were done quite a long time ago, and because medication for epilepsy has really improved dramatically over the last half century, there are very, very few cases of people with these kinds of surgeries now. I mean, you wouldn't do it unless you really need to do it. It's very invasive.
Of course, yeah.
So it's becoming quite hard to really replicate or extend these kinds of studies. It's still being done. I was in Santa Barbara earlier this year, and Mike Gazzaniga was there. He's still around. And their group is a group led by a researcher called Mike Miller now, who's doing super interesting experiments on split brain patients. So we're still learning more, but I think the emerging story is that it's like anything. It just gets a bit more complicated when you look into it. So in vision, for instance, it turns out that each hemisphere can see something in wherever it appears in the visual field, but it's putting information together across hemispheres that where the problems lie.
I see. Okay, I must ask you about one more theme before we end, and that is, of course, the issue of free will. And I'm thinking of these experiments. Was it Libet who did, and some other people, showing that sort of the muscles were sort of had made the decision before the conscious decision happens. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about the research these days on that?
Yeah. So actually, the first research that I was doing on this was how to pronounce this guy's name, because sometimes it was Libet.
Okay.
Sometimes I think it's Libet. I think that's the consensus, but he died quite some time ago. But that's I think that's what most people settled on. And really, his experiments, which were done in the 1980s, the ones people talk about, did stir up this whole debate about free will. When I was writing the book, this was the chapter I found the most challenging to write. I think because it puts together a whole bunch of potentially confusing things. We have the issue of consciousness, which is kind of confusing anyway. Then we have whether the universe is deterministic or not, and that's kind of confusing. And then we have all these issues about moral responsibility and holding people responsible for their actions, which is also confusing for different reasons. So I think there's good reason why debates about free will seem particularly thorny. And frankly, I also noticed when I give public talks about consciousness, it's really the issue of free will that seems most troublesome for people. Now, people often are okay if you tell them that that the red color they see in the world isn't really there, it's constructed. And you can even say the same about many aspects of the self, that the experience of being a self is a kind of construction. If you try and tell the same story about free will, that's where a lot of pushback happens. It seems to be the aspects of self that people are most keen to hang on to. Anyway, Libet's experiments were very interesting. They were very simple. I mean, what he did essentially was ask people to make a voluntary movement, a movement of their own, in quotes, free will, whenever they chose. And he measured three things. He measured the timing of the movement. It could be something like just raising your wrist like that. The timing of the actual movement through sensors on the muscles. Measured what was going on in the brain through EEG. And also, critically, asked people to say when they felt the urge to make the movement. So the timing of their experience of free will. That was the sort of new bit. And what did he find? Well, he found that before the movement, brain activity was already ramping up. So if I was going to move my right hand, I would be sort of activity ramping up in the left hemisphere above the motor cortex, supplementary motor area. Before. This had been already known since the 1950s or 60s by some German neurophysiologists. It's called the readiness potential. But what Libet found was that the timing of the conscious intention was after the readiness potential had already started to ramp up. So it seemed as if the brain was already gearing up to make the move before the person felt the conscious urge to make the move. And this was taken by many people as like, look, there's no such thing as free will because your brain's already planning and setting in train these the mechanisms to make a voluntary movement before you even felt the intention to do that. So your experience can have no causal role in generating that experience and this generating that action. Now, this is a great experiment, and it's led to so many follow-ups.
Yeah, I thought so. Has it been replicated?
Oh yeah. It absolutely has. It's been replicated, but it's also been found that there are many reasons why it doesn't do what people initially thought that it did, which is sort of disprove free will. For instance, there's beautiful work by a French researcher called Aaron Scherger, who basically showed that, or just noticed firstly that there's a big problem with these Libet experiments, which is people only looked for this readiness potential on those cases where people made this voluntary movement. They didn't look at all the other times where people didn't make a voluntary movement. And it kind of turns out that there's things that look like readiness potentials maybe happening all the time. And it's only when you retrospectively look back that you see a readiness potential. So he did these things where sometimes he prompted people to make a movement by, there was a beep that sounded, and you say, okay, when you hear the beep, you do it. And it turned out that when people were faster to respond to the beep, there was something that looked like a readiness potential behind them, as if the brain was already kind of near to this state of making an action. So in this experiment, it really seems like a bit of an artifact that when the decision doesn't really matter, like, raise your hand whenever you like, the brain just has to come up with some basis for making a movement now and not at some other time. And it uses this kind of randomly fluctuating activity to do that. So another set of experiments by a colleague of mine, Liad Mudrik in Tel Aviv, found that if decisions really matter, if people are making a choice between options that they care about, then also the readiness potential kind of goes away. So the brain's now got other reasons to make the decision on. Now, my own view about free will is what philosophers call compatibilism. So,
like Daniel Dennett.
Yeah, it's pretty similar to Daniel Dennett's views. He's also was a compatibilist. And that's the view that the universe may or may not be deterministic. That doesn't matter. There's a sensible way to think about free will, even in a deterministic universe. That's the position that I think is the right kind of position to have. But it depends what you mean by free will. And like, if you mean that there's this kind of spooky uncaused cause that swoops in and changes the flow of physical events, then you're in trouble. Now that's the kind of free will I don't think you can really justify, and I don't think, but also it's not the kind of free will that we need. And fundamentally, we are complex organisms with many, as Dennett said, many degrees of freedom. And some of our actions have causes that come more from within the body than from the outside world. Like when I choose to make a cup of tea, the causes of that stretch back to my being brought up in England, but the fact that I like tea and I feel a bit drowsy, whatever it might be. And my hypothesis about this is that the experience of free will it's a kind of perception. It's what's happening when the brain perceives that the causes of an action come mainly from within the body.
Yeah.
So the experience doesn't cause the action. It's a kind of self-fulfilling perception of the action. So I like to think of free will a little bit like colors. You know, colors don't exist in this sort of mind-dependent way that they seem to. Like the content of an experience of color is that redness is out there in the world. Now that's false. You know, colors aren't out there in the world in a mind-independent way. But experiences of color are still very useful. They do really useful things for us as organisms. I think much the same is true about free will. Like the content of an experience of free will is that the experience caused the action. And I think that's false in the same way that our experiences of red are false. Like we shouldn't take them literally, but they're still useful for the organism. It's very useful for the organism to label in our experience actions as, you know, what caused that? You know, was that something that came from within or something that didn't? It's very helpful, you know, as part of the general integration of information from the world and the body, that these actions feel different.
Interesting. I guess you've discussed this with people like Sapolsky, who wouldn't agree with you, I guess.
You know, I have not had the pleasure of meeting Robert Sapolsky yet, but I'm pretty sure we would disagree, because he takes, in my reading of somebody like Robert Sapolsky in his most recent book, Determined, is basically saying we don't have this kind of spooky free will where, you know, where a conscious experience causes something to happen that wouldn't otherwise happen. So therefore, there's no reasonable version of free will at all, and we just need to kind of make peace with that. And I just think this is extremizing the sort of available positions on free will. So I'm pretty sure he and I would disagree.
Yeah. Okay, my last question to you would be, what are you most excited about right now in your research? I mean, what lies ahead in your work?
It's kind of a motley assortment of different directions. You know, the truth is that a lot of what I end up doing becomes driven by the people that come to work in the lab. And this is great. You know, I think as now I've been in this job for quite a while, it's you know, one of the things I feel I can contribute mainly is helping people develop their own lines of research and so on, and get some super smart people coming in to work with, and that's what really excites me. And I've got a few new people joining the lab in the next few months. Some of the things we're going to work on, so I don't know exactly which way it's going to go yet, but broadly, the idea is to build computational models of perceptual experience. I mean, that doesn't sound that exciting, but it's really playing out this story of the brain as a prediction machine and trying to connect it to explain different kinds of experience, to try and flesh out this story in different ways. So the specific things I am very excited about here is this study about perceptual diversity. You know, I think this is gonna it's exciting for me because it's one of the few things I've done where it's kind of exploratory. You know, we don't know what we'll find. Let's see what's out there, and that's
very exciting.
That's lovely. You know, I really like that, and that might lead to lots of interesting follow-on studies about, you know, what's the genetic contribution to perceptual differences. You know, are there perceptual personalities in the same way we have, you know, kind of cognitive personalities? That's one thing. Another direction I'm very excited about is where we started our conversation. Really, there's such a febrile discourse right now about artificial intelligence and its relationship to consciousness, that I'm very eager to. I write about it a little bit in the book. It's the last chapter about machine minds and the unlikelihood of AI being conscious. But there's a lot more to say about that, a lot more to really delve into about this relationship between brains, computers, artificial intelligence, algorithms in general. And so that's on a more theoretical side. But, you know, what I hope that will contribute is maybe helping shape, this is this is a very optimistic view of me, but I would like to be able to help shape the evolution of AI technologies in ways which are not clouded by all these conceptual errors people are making about consciousness and so on, so that we get the kinds of AI systems that will really complement human consciousness and human cognition, and not get distracted by some of these more dystopian sci-fi scenarios.
Oh, you really have a very exciting job, I must say. It sounds wonderful.
Well, that's working. I mean, in practice, it seems to be mainly answering emails, but you know, that's probably true of most jobs.
Okay, thank you so much, Anil Seth, for being in my podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.